Hi, I'm Grace Laudick, and this is Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times on ThinkTech Hawaii. Today, we will be discussing college culture abroad and how education has influenced national responses to recent events. My guest today is Jennah Waynant. She is a recent graduate of Kapiolani Community College, and she holds a degree in New Media Arts with a specialization in animation. She had the experiences of attending school both in China and the United States, and today we will be discussing and comparing and contrasting her experiences as a student abroad and both here in Hawaii. Thank you for being a guest on my show today, Jennah.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I thought that you would be the perfect guest on our show today because you have experience with education both abroad and over here at home, and I'd just love to hear about your experiences today on what you've learned in both settings. So could you let us know, just to provide some context for our guests, what years you lived in China and what grades you attended while you were in school in China?
So I was in Shanghai from 2014 to the very beginning of 2016. I did a 2.5 years there throughout freshman year to almost the end of junior year, and then I moved back to the United States. It was an international American school, which means it was not in the public school system at all, completely separate and based structurally the way you would imagine American private school would be.
And what was the name of the school that you attended in Shanghai?
Concordia International School of Shanghai. It has a Chinese name. Apologies, I cannot pronounce it.
So, in what ways would you say that the Chinese educational system was different from the United States education system?
Well, if we're talking the actual Chinese education system, it's very different from the school that I went to, but I was exposed to it for a little while. It's very well structured. It's very basic. There's a very clear learning system that they implement. There's things like rigid routines every morning. There's exercises that are broadcasted. The workload is, of course, very severe. Compared to an American, say, public school, where the hours are a little bit more easygoing, the workload is less enforced. I feel like there's a little less maybe cultural drive to succeed as well that kind of shows in the students and how they perform.
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of recent coverage about how many Asian countries are pushing for STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in their education. Is this something that was embodied and evident as you were attending school in China during that time?
Yeah, I would say hugely. The vast majority of Americans who were attending schools like mine came from families that worked in car companies that were outsourcing labor in China, mostly based in Michigan. So a lot of like science, mechanical based jobs not only were already there, but also cultivated there throughout the next generation of people who would run these businesses.
What would you say were some of the biggest challenges for you to transition into this new educational system and just learning the culture abroad?
I think international schools, specifically Concordia, did an excellent job as far as learning how to integrate new students. I felt like it went pretty seamlessly considering the extreme move and culture shock that it was. Aside from their very extensive facilities, it was a comfortable school that was well structured, so you felt very at home. And the area in which it was placed was kind of an America town. So a lot of the places were like styled in a Western manner, made you feel comfortable, but at the same time you have the issue of a language barrier and new cultural norms and a higher level of expectation when it comes to education, I'd say.
As an American student who was perhaps used to the more easygoing pace that American schools have and a little bit of a lesser workload, how did you cope with the stresses of having to suddenly adjust to a higher pace level of education? And do you think that's detrimental or advantageous for students?
I think it's very dependent on the student. So I know for myself, I was doing okay academically before I went to China. However, I was placed in a lower class, basically had to redo a math class because I wasn't up to their standard. So in that sense, if you are forced later to compete, say for college, you do face a downfall. But also I do think that comes down to more of a funding thing. The international school had an incredible amount of funding. Most American public schools do not.
Mhm. You mentioned that the Chinese school structure seems to have a more superior structure and better organization than the American school system. What exactly do you mean by that?
Basically, I would just say there's more structure. So we're talking about classrooms being devoid of anything that aren't really like essentials, desks, books, things like that. They have a very linear learning system, very clear path to follow. A lot of schools are like boarding schools too, not for a year or so, but more like for the week where you'll go home on the weekend, stay at your school for the week. The school that I went to school close by was like that as well. And like I said, one of the biggest things would be the morning exercises. So basically, you line up in the courtyard and do exercises after someone in a loudspeaker shouts down numbers to count to, which is something not really found in American systems, minus pledging allegiance. So that's a big difference.
Mhm. Many Asian countries tend to be more collectivist and focused on the group, whereas many American schools tend to be more individualistic and just focusing on the individual. How did that play out at an international school? Would you say that it was a pretty good blend between a collectivist and an individualist culture?
I'd say so. I think it also had the benefit of being a school that served like very, I want to say, influential families. So a lot of these kids were expected to do good things. So in that way, it had another level of that kind of motivation, but also culturally, it means more to the people around you, I would feel, in China if you were to fail. So there's more of a mentality that you should succeed, which did kind of bleed into the way that we navigated our own academics. Whereas in America, it's very like you fail or you succeed on your own basis. So there's less of that external pressure, which, can go both ways.
Mhm. With this mentality to succeed in China, how does this play out for students after they graduate from high school? Do you think that students are overall better prepared by the education itself, or do you think that students are more well prepared because of that internal mentality that they need to succeed and do well for their families?
Again, I would say it's definitely a combination. For me personally, going to the international school motivated me to actually get my GED instead of doing my senior year in the public school system here because of some issues with transferring credits and earning college credit. I saw from my preparation, college preparation specifically from my international school, that I could essentially make my own educational path, and it ended up working. So in that sense, it set me up very good foundationally. And I do feel like that is one big difference between motivation to go to college, say in Asia or in an international school, and for a public school here.
Would you say that overall China does a better job of preparing their students to be successful after high school graduation? I understand that many people now have this conception that every student is going to attend college right after high school, but not every student necessarily does. Do you think that China does a better job of taking that into account and giving them the skill set so that they're ready to enter the workforce after high school?
I think workforce is the key word here. You did mention that most people internally have the motivation of when they go to high school, they will then graduate from college. But I feel like the understanding that, say, like a labor based job is more understood there. If you say you're going to craft school out of college or out of high school instead of going to college here, you might face some backlash or something like that. But going to college and having a high status job, which in an American mind seems like the ultimate goal, is way more based on your socioeconomic status and, say, intellectual ability in a place like China, where the system to succeed is a lot more structured and therefore a lot more limited.
Mhm. You mentioned earlier that once you had to transition back to the American educational system after your time in China, you just decided to accelerate your education and go straight to college. So, what was it like the semesters that you did spend in the American high school system compared to the Chinese high school system that you were in?
In the expat community, we talk about something called reverse culture shock. And it's when you come back to where you're from and you're extremely like surprised and have to readjust. It was very similar to that for me because, for example, for the first time, I had to really struggle to get academic needs met. I had AP credits from my previous high school that were not taken. At the public school that I attended. So basically, I had to teach myself my own classes. There was a lot less structure. There was more overstressed teachers. There was less room to grow and figure out what you wanted to do. So I decided, based on what I had known about college applications, gleaned from the previous school, that this would be a better option for me.
Mhm. You mentioned that teachers and administrators tend to be more disorganized, and perhaps there isn't as good of a structure in the American education system. How did it play out into the Chinese education system, and how did they ensure that administrators and teachers were more adequately prepared to teach students?
Well, like I said before, I can't speak necessarily to the Chinese public school system because I did not attend the public school system there. But from what I could tell, uh, being a teacher was a little bit more valued culturally there. So I feel like there was a little bit more of demand for the job and people to willingly fill that. Here, teachers are more underpaid, so there's less of a motivation to go there. Also, the issue with having only a bachelor's and being able to teach. So you'll have some people who are teaching things maybe they're not qualified in or taking on too many teaching jobs. The school that I went to proudly boasts like 79% of their faculty having advanced degrees. And I believe that's more of an issue with the class thing than anything else, but it still does show when you look at how prepared your students are. Having qualified teachers who are well paid pays off.
In having these qualified teachers, would you say that overall your classes in China were of significantly better classes? And did you perhaps have different class choices that weren't available in the American public school system?
Yes, exactly. That was one of my biggest struggles. Two of the AP classes that I was taking uh, were not offered, and I left in the middle of junior year. So I had basically like half a credit. I had done the work, I could not finish the class, so I ended up doing it on my own. And I also had an issue with the standardized test towards the end of my time there, in which it was just mixed up. So I wasn't able to get to it about until like I want to say a couple weeks after the rest of the standardized testing was finished. So there was a lot of issues that I had with transferring credits, making sure that I could essentially cash in the ones that I was getting in for college in order to save money later on. So just the transfer and the fact that the disparity between the level of resources really did affect how well I could do and what classes I could take was huge.
Mhm. You mentioned that many American students have this mentality that school is perhaps not as important as in the eyes of a Chinese student who's more driven for success. How do you think that this causes the school culture to be altered, and how does this change the attitudes of students every time they walk into school every morning? Was it a completely different feel at your school in China where people were more motivated to do better for themselves?
It was a blend. Since I went to like an American Chinese school, we had a mix of kids from everywhere. So the feeling of like personal responsibility that it would reflect back on your family was also varied. But the concept of saving face in China, I would say, is a huge driving motivator just for social conformity, social interaction, just making sure you succeed and help the people around you, respect the people around you, and respect your family. So I feel like that was definitely stronger with the Chinese students as opposed to the American students. We tend to feel more individualistic, rely less on the bonds of culture to support us. In that way, I always did notice that like the outside behavior of the Chinese students was always more controlled, very, polite and demean, kind of, how do you say, more respectful, as opposed to an American student who would be a little more acting out.
Mhm. And overall, if you had attended the American public school system for all 4 years in high school, do you feel as though you would have been less prepared had you not attended the Chinese educational system?
Hugely. I credit that school to really motivating me to take my education into my own hands because it was only when it was jeopardized that I was forced to do something kind of out of the ordinary. Most people don't enjoy the concept of dropping out. It has a stigma to it, but personally, I found it was a better route than trying to make myself earn credits that I already earned for an extra 2 years. So that school was just incredible in allowing me to know not only how to advance myself, but giving me the confidence and the knowledge in order to do that. If I had started and ended with a public school, I'm guessing I would not have gotten as far as I am now at all.
Mhm. I'd love to continue talking to you about this after a break, Jenna, but actually, in a moment, we will be taking a short break. Again, I'm Grace Laudick, and you are watching Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times on Think Tech Hawaii with my special guest, Jennah Waynant. We will be back shortly.
Aloha, I'm Keisha King, host of Crossroads in Learning on ThinkTech Hawaii. On Crossroads in Learning, our guest and I discuss all aspects of education here in Hawaii and throughout the country. You can join us for stimulating conversations to enrich, enliven, and educate. We are streamed live on ThinkTech bi-weekly at 4 p.m. on Mondays. Thanks so much for watching our show. We look forward to seeing you then. Aloha.
Welcome back to Educating Ourselves in These Difficult Times with my guest, Jennah Waynant, recent graduate of Kapiolani Community College. Jennah, right before our break, I remember we were discussing about how students can be better prepared for college. So, as someone who's had experience both at an international school and a local school, what can we learn from other countries to better improve our curriculum system in the United States to better prepare students for college?
I think it comes down to funding, first and foremost. The most notable thing about the difference between the two schools is the amount of money that went into facilities encouraging students to choose their own careers, to find their own passions, and to pursue that. So, because there were so many options to explore future careers, such as career fairs, where you would have parents come in, talk about the careers companies that they currently run, opportunities to intern for very brief amounts of time as a high schooler in some of these companies to feel them out, yearly trips out as well. So, just the money that went into figuring out what a child wanted to do with their life helped immensely, which you just cannot get in public school.
You mentioned that there's this idea in China of helping people to fulfill their dreams and to fulfill their passions. Would you say that this sentiment is not as evident in the American educational system as individualistic as we are?
I think the idea of success is a little bit different, because individualism means that success is personal based on you and only belonging to you. It is more, I would say, isolating in the process. You might get less support from your family in your decision. On the flip side, if your family has like too much influence or you're too worried about what your community will do in regard to your choices, you might end up doing something you don't enjoy. However, whether or not that pays off, whether it becomes your passion or it just pays well is, who knows?
Mhm. And what classes did you take at your school in China that weren't offered in the United States that perhaps better prepared you to become a college student as soon as you were able to?
Well, I was lucky. There was one graphic design class at the public school I attended that I was able to transfer in, but they did not have near the amount of technology that I was used to working at the two other art classes I attended in Concordia, as well as some robotics and basic coding classes that I took there as well. I was not able to continue them and unfortunately cannot code as a result of that. But just the variety that they allowed you in itself proved that the opportunities were vastly different.
Mhm. We actually just had a guest send in a question, and they were wondering, were your teachers American at Concordia, and did you make good friends there?
Yes and yes. There were a lot of American teachers. There are also teachers from a lot of other places as well. A lot of American teachers who had traveled to, say, 3 or 4 countries, taught there for a couple years. The international community is a really interesting conglomerate of people who basically move between like this very large piece of land. And I met some really interesting teachers, some great life experiences, and friends that I keep to this day, really. It's a very unique experience interacting with a third culture where everyone in a certain place is very, very different, does not necessarily agree with other people's points of view or where they come from, but are forced to be in a foreign city together. So it definitely, it was a fun experience.
Intercultural communication competency is something that's come to light recently, especially with news pertaining to racism, the Black Lives Matter movement, protests, and people just not understanding the differences between people. Was there any issues with racism or miscultural understanding at your international school in China?
In my international school, I would say no. There was a pretty healthy balance of a lot of people, surprisingly, a lot of people from Michigan, overwhelmingly from Michigan, which kind of threw the stats off a bit. But and of course, it's true of everywhere. Every country has its own prejudices, so the stigmas and the racial associations get worse as you leave places like Pudong, which is a predominantly American inhabited city. It gets worse as you get farther away in that more rural. There is definitely an issue with colorism and fetishization of a Western culture.
Would you say that racism is as rampant in China as it is in the United States? And do you think that they would respond similarly as the United States to instances of racism, for example, through protests and looting?
I say this delicately with a preface of this is just my opinion and my experience, but based on the current issue China is having with publicizing their concentration camps of imprisoned Muslim ethnicity people, I would say they have similar issues. They are dealt with differently because of the lack of police presence and freedom of speech, so to say, that we have here in America. We can riot. Riots are not as socially acceptable there. They have a very bad history with riots, and a lot of large government decisions and actions go on without the knowledge or consent of the people. So there's a different level of awareness when it comes to these issues that we in America, since we are able to have freedom of speech and freedom of, internet essentially, are just more aware of. We see it more often.
Is racism and learning how to respect other cultures something that was covered at Concordia in Shanghai?
Yes, extensively. There's a process for every expat when they enter the country who kind of runs them through cultural norms, things to talk about, things not to talk about, for the first couple weeks, just to get you adjusted. And the school was a very accepting community. But of course, there were ground rules of no discrimination. If anyone, encouraged any kind of behaviors like that, it was immediately shut down. It wasn't allowed. But like I said, those kind of that was more of the American culture's way of dealing with diversity as opposed to China's attitude towards foreigners.
Would you say that racism and intercultural communication competencies was something that was also discussed in your American high school and college experience?
I would say less so. The education I got that had any racial bias here was to do more with Hawaii's history with different ethnicities and things like that. In college, I didn't take a lot of those classes since I already had credits, so I can't really speak to that, but I can definitely say, and partially just because it was an issue you cannot avoid in an international city. A lot more weight was put on learning how to deal with those nuances in my international school as opposed to anywhere here.
In our evolving world, despite the fact that many people believe that racism isn't as rampant in Hawaii, do you think that talking about racism, controversial issues, and learning to respect other cultures is something that should be incorporated into the American curriculum?
I think so. I think we have enough backlash as far as isolated and publicized incidents that show that our children are maybe not being as educated as they could be to the sensitivities of these issues. I think that Hawaii is somewhat culturally different in terms of discrimination, but that does not negate the fact that I think we should be equally educated about the history of racial injustice in the US and also in here and on island.
In what ways do you wish that your college experience had been different to help better prepare you for the outside world, whether that just be a citizen interacting with people every day or more pragmatic matters, such as searching for a job and job preparation?
I think because of the field that I'm in, the answer I can give is very narrow. But the program I was in was run by someone who was very highly qualified, very motivated to keep bringing in new voices, new informants for us to be best prepared to enter an animation art based kind of workforce. The fact of the matter is there's a limited amount of jobs on island for these sorts of things. So there's only so far you can go. I don't know if that's something the school can help, but it definitely is something that they tried to remedy by bringing in a constant flow of guests, showing us opportunity. I have no complaints.
Would you say that the disorganized structure and just the lack of administrative support in our Hawaii high school system is also evident in our Hawaii public college system?
Honestly, I would say to a point, yes. I know that I had a credit transfer problem both when coming into high school here and then also again when coming into college. I actually had to retake a couple classes that I had credits for. And I think in that kind of way, a lot of the technical stuff gets lost through the cracks. And again, I feel like that just comes down to funding, people being maybe overstaffed, not enough jobs, or just, systematic problems.
We had another guest send in a question, and they wanted to know, what did you learn about yourself by being in an international situation?
What did I learn about myself? Huh. I think it taught resilience more than anything. Like, there's nothing like being dropped in the middle of a foreign country where you don't speak the language to teach you to kind of like get a bit of backbone, so to speak. It also, I feel like, can be very damaging if you're not prepared for that kind of extraction. I was in a very small community before moving to China, and leaving that very sheltered place was a huge shock, especially considering the American students bringing their culture into a place where laws are less enforced for Americans, if at all.
What would you say that the transition was like coming back to the United States? Was it as challenging as the transition you had to make going to China the first time?
I think it was more challenging than I expected. I wouldn't say it was harder, but getting used to a new system again also gives you the opportunity to look at it from a different perspective. So, coming from a place like China where I don't speak the language, but they have incredible infrastructure as far as transportation. So, if I don't speak a word, I can still go where I need to go. Coming back to a place where I do speak the language, but our bus system is a lot more complicated. Small things like that did give me a bit of a shock.
You mentioned that resilience, building a backbone, and taking charge of your education were some of the most important skills that you got out of your college experience. As someone who's recently graduated college, do you have any advice for students who might currently be going into college or going through college for how they can best maximize their college experience?
I think I think the best advice for someone who's starting off in college, is assuming you kind of know what you want to go into, is to just try to glean as many basic skills as you can as possible. Just try to learn the basics, let yourself get comfortable with what you enjoy doing, take your time with things. I know I, for one, overstressed myself, at least in the last semester, which had a negative bearing on my health long term, which becomes a factor as you're an adult out in the world. So, making sure you care about what you're doing, you can do it consistently, and you're keeping yourself healthy while you do it, I feel like are the fundamentals.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Jennah, both in China and the United States. It was fascinating getting a view and comparing and contrasting and figuring out what we can learn from situations abroad. So thank you again, Jennah, and thank you for watching Think Tech Hawaii. We hope that today's program shed some light on what life is like as a student, both locally and internationally, and what we can learn from other cultures and educational systems. I'm Grace Laudick, and this is Think Tech Hawaii. I'll see you every other Thursday at noon. Thank you.